It was a cool summer evening in the small, suburban town of Brookhaven. The streets were quiet, with only the occasional hum of passing cars disturbing the stillness. Officer David Campbell, a 10-year veteran of the police force, sat in his patrol car parked at a dimly lit intersection. His partner, Officer Mark Peterson, was tapping on his phone, scrolling through mundane updates on social media. "David, you see that car?" Peterson pointed at a sleek black sedan passing through the intersection. David's eyes narrowed. The car was impeccably clean, with dark-tinted windows and polished rims. It wasn't speeding or weaving, but something about it seemed out of place to him. "Suspicious," David muttered. "Looks like it doesn't belong around here." Peterson nodded in agreement, though neither of them had a concrete reason to think so. They turned on the patrol car's lights and pulled out, tailing the vehicle. After a few blocks, they activated their siren. The black sedan slowed to a stop under a flickering street lamp. The driver, the tall, well-dressed black man, sat calmly behind the wheel, his hands visible on the dashboard. His posture was straight, almost defiant, as if he knew exactly what was about to happen. David approached the driver's side window cautiously, his hand resting on his holstered firearm. "License and registration," he barked. The man inside the car complied without hesitation, retrieving his documents with precise movements. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. David glanced at the documents and the man. "What are you doing out here this late?" The man raised an eyebrow. "Driving home. Is that a crime?" David bristled at the tone, perceiving it as disrespect. "Step out of the car," he ordered abruptly. The driver hesitated. "May I ask why? Am I being accused of something?" David's patience snapped. "Step out of the car now," he shouted, his hand moving to unclip his taser. As the tension mounted, Peterson moved to the passenger side, adding to the pressure. Reluctantly, the man opened the door and stepped out. His tailored suit and polished shoes gleamed under the streetlight, a stark contrast to the gritty asphalt beneath his feet. David's interrogation escalated. He accused the man of looking out of place, insinuating that he might be involved in drug trafficking or theft. The man protested, calmly at first, but his frustration grew as the officers ignored his explanations. The situation spiraled out of control when David decided to cuff the man, for safety. As the cold steel closed around his wrists, the man's expression hardened. "You don't know who I am," he said quietly, his voice filled with warning. But David wasn't listening. He was too consumed by his assumptions to see the storm he was about to unleash. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed faintly as Elijah Porter, still handcuffed, was led through the precinct. Other officers glanced up from their desks, some with curiosity, others with amusement. Elijah's tailored suit and confident stride seemed out of place in the dingy station. David and Peterson brought Elijah to a holding cell and pushed him inside. "Sit tight," David said dismissively. Elijah didn't resist. He sat on the cold, hard bench, his hands resting calmly in his lap. His sharp mind was already racing. He knew he could end this situation with a single phone call, but he decided to wait. He wanted to see how far they would take this charade. Hours passed. No one came to take his statement or process his release. Instead, he overheard snippets of conversation from the officers outside, jokes about uppity types and veiled references to race. Eventually, David entered the holding area, holding Elijah's wallet. "So, Elijah Porter," he drawled, "what do you do for a living? Dealer? Scammer?" Elijah met his gaze evenly. "I'm a federal prosecutor." David froze, the smug grin slipping from his face. "What?" "You heard me," Elijah said, his voice steady. "I prosecute federal cases for the Department of Justice. And unless you want to explain this unlawful arrest to a judge, I suggest you get my lawyer on the phone." David's face turned red. He muttered something under his breath and stormed out of the room. Slamming the door behind him, David sat at his desk, his head in his hands. The night's events replayed in his mind, but not with the clarity of hindsight, just anger and confusion. How could someone like that, someone who didn't belong, be in a position of power? He thought back to his childhood in a working-class neighborhood, where prejudices were as ingrained as Sunday church services. His father, a retired police officer, often warned him about those people. They'll play the victim card every time, his father had said, shaking his head over the evening news. David carried those lessons into adulthood, never questioning them. They shaped his career, his decisions, and, most importantly, his perspective. To him, the world was divided into us and them, and his duty as a police officer was to protect us. But now, for the first time, doubt crept into his mind. If Elijah Porter was innocent, what did that mean for all the others he had judged and dismissed so quickly? Elijah sat in the cell, his mind drifting to his childhood in the inner city. He remembered his mother's sacrifices, his father's absence, and the relentless determination that had driven him to succeed. He had worked harder than anyone else, knowing that his skin color would always make his achievements seem lesser in the eyes of some. He thought about the irony of his situation. As a federal prosecutor, he had worked tirelessly to uphold the law, often at great personal cost. And yet here he was, reduced to a stereotype, humiliated in a way that no amount of success could shield him from. But Elijah was no stranger to adversity. He decided that this incident wouldn't end with his release. It was bigger than him. It was about a system that allowed officers like David Campbell to act with impunity. When his lawyer finally arrived, Elijah outlined his plan. He wouldn't just seek justice for himself. He would expose the deeply ingrained biases within the police force and demand systemic change. As Elijah was released later that evening, David avoided his gaze, but Elijah looked him straight in the eye, a silent promise of what was to come. By the next morning, the incident had already started making waves. Someone at the precinct, perhaps a rookie officer with a conscience or an outsider seeking attention, leaked footage from the station's security cameras. The video showed Elijah being dragged into the station, his suit disheveled, his wrists cuffed. Another clip captured the tense interaction between David and Elijah, including Elijah's calm but cutting revelation, "I'm a federal prosecutor." Social media erupted. The hashtags #JusticeForElijah and #EndPoliceBias trended nationwide. News outlets picked up the story, interviewing legal analysts and civil rights advocates who condemned the blatant abuse of power. Some defended David, painting him as a victim of cancel culture. But their voices were drowned out by a tidal wave of public outrage. Elijah watched the storm unfold from his home, sipping coffee at the kitchen table. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages from colleagues, friends, and strangers offering their support. His lawyer, Maria Santiago, a sharp-witted and fearless advocate, sat across from him, her laptop open to the latest news updates. "This is bigger than we expected," Maria said, scrolling through a thread of tweets. "People are demanding not just accountability for David Campbell, but a full investigation into the precinct." Elijah leaned back, his expression contemplative. "Good. It's time we address the root of the problem, not just the symptoms." Maria looked at him over her glasses. "You're prepared for this to get ugly, right? They'll dig into your past, your cases, anything they can use to discredit you." Elijah's jaw tightened. "Let them. I spent my entire career fighting for justice. I'm not backing down now." David sat in his modest living room, the blinds drawn to block out the world. His wife, Sarah, paced back and forth, her face etched with worry. The news anchor's voices blared from the television, recounting the incident and speculating on its implications. "This is a disaster," Sarah said, her tone sharp with anxiety. "They're calling for your badge." "David, what were you thinking?" David rubbed his temples, his head pounding. "I didn't know who he was." "Okay," He looked suspicious. That's what we're trained to notice. Sarah stopped pacing and stared at him. Suspicious because he's black? Do you even hear yourself? David glared at her. Defensive. Don't start with that liberal nonsense. Sarah, I was doing my job. Your job is to protect and serve, she snapped. Not to humiliate innocent people. The argument was cut short by a knock at the door. David hesitated, his pulse quickening. When he opened it, he found two senior officers waiting, their expressions grim. David, we need to talk. One of them said, this situation is getting out of control. Internal affairs is involved, and the chief wants answers. As the officers entered, David felt the walls closing in. He realized that the institution he had trusted and defended his entire life might not stand by him after all. Elijah's legal team expanded quickly. Activists, fellow lawyers, and even former police officers volunteered their expertise. Maria spearheaded the investigation, focusing on uncovering patterns of misconduct within the precinct. What they found was chilling. Over the past 5 years, the precinct had logged dozens of complaints of racial profiling, excessive force, and wrongful arrests. Many of these complaints were dismissed without investigation. David Campbell's name appeared in multiple reports, including one involving a young black teenager who had been violently arrested for resisting during a routine stop. The teenager's family had filed a lawsuit, but the case was quietly settled out of court. Elijah studied the files late into the night, his determination growing with each page. He thought of the countless people who had been silenced or ignored, their lives disrupted or destroyed by systemic injustice. We need to make this public, Elijah told Maria during a late-night strategy session. The world needs to see the pattern. Maria nodded. We'll release a detailed report to the press. But we also need to focus on the lawsuit. This isn't just about David Campbell. It's about dismantling the system that enabled him. The next morning, Elijah held a press conference on the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed as he stood at the podium, flanked by Maria and a group of supporters. This isn't just my fight, Elijah began, his voice steady and resolute. This is a fight for every person who has been judged, mistreated, or dehumanized because of the color of their skin. We will not stop until justice is served. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the streets. As the public backlash grew, both Elijah and David faced mounting pressure, but in vastly different ways. For Elijah, the support of his family was a source of strength. His mother, a retired schoolteacher, called him every day to remind him of how proud she was. His younger sister, Naomi, helped manage the influx of messages from supporters and journalists. Elijah's home became a hub of activity, filled with friends and colleagues working tirelessly to push the case forward. But for David, home was no longer a refuge. His wife, Sarah, struggled to reconcile her love for him with her growing disapproval of his actions. Their teenage son, Ethan, avoided him altogether, embarrassed by the media coverage and the whispers at school. Dad, why did you do it? Ethan asked one evening, his voice barely above a whisper. Why did you stop him? David stared at his son, unable to answer. He wanted to say that he had been doing his job, but deep down, he knew the truth was more complicated and more damning. Meanwhile, Sarah began attending community meetings on police reform, much to David's dismay. One night, after returning from a particularly emotional gathering, she confronted him. David, they told stories about people who were harassed, beaten, even killed by police. She said, her voice trembling. Do you even understand the damage you've done? David snapped. I made a mistake. Okay, what do you want me to do? Grovel? Quit my job. Sarah stared at him, her eyes filled with disappointment. I want you to take responsibility. David, for once in your life, admit that you were wrong. As David watched her walk away, he felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He had spent years justifying his actions, but now, Faced with the consequences, he began to question everything he thought he knew. The first day of the trial drew a massive crowd. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs that read "Justice for Elijah" and "End Police Bias Now." Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Reporters filled the gallery, their cameras clicking as Elijah walked in, his posture straight and his expression resolute. Maria Santiago followed closely behind, her presence commanding respect. Across the courtroom, David Campbell sat stiffly at the defense table, his lawyer, Greg Daniels, whispering to him. David's face betrayed a mixture of anger and fear, his usual confidence replaced by unease under the spotlight. The opening statements set the tone for the trial. Maria's voice was steady but impassioned as she addressed the jury. "This case isn't just about one man's abuse of power," she began. "It's about a system that allows prejudice to flourish unchecked. Elijah Porter is not the first victim, but with your help, he can be the last." Greg Daniels took a more combative approach, attempting to portray David as a hardworking officer who had made an honest mistake. Officer Campbell acted based on reasonable suspicion, Daniels argued. He didn't know Mr. Porter's identity at the time. This isn't about race. It's about ensuring public safety. Elijah's jaw tightened as he listened. He knew this defense all too well, the deflection, the denial, the refusal to address the deeper issues. But he remained calm, determined to let the evidence speak for itself. The prosecution began with testimonies from witnesses who had seen the footage of Elijah's arrest. A retired police officer, who now advocated for reform, testified about the culture of racial profiling within the precinct. "I've seen it firsthand," he admitted. "Officers are trained to see black men as threats, regardless of their behavior." David's lawyer objected, claiming the testimony was speculative. But the damage was done. The jury's expressions suggested that they were beginning to grasp the broader implications of the case. As the trial progressed, David found himself increasingly isolated. His colleagues avoided him, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. His superiors, once supportive, now distanced themselves, portraying him as a rogue officer who had acted independently of department policy. At home, things were no better. Sarah barely spoke to him, her disappointment palpable. Ethan avoided him entirely, retreating to his room whenever David was around. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, Sarah confronted him. "You need to tell the truth, David," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Not just for Elijah, but for yourself. You can't keep hiding behind excuses." David's temper flared. "You don't understand what it's like out there, Sarah. Every day, we're risking our lives. I did what I thought was right. But it wasn't right," she shot back. "And you know it." The argument left David shaken. He retreated to his garage, where he kept a box of old photos and memorabilia from his early days on the force. Among the items was a letter from a young boy he had saved during a domestic violence call. "You're my hero," the letter read. David stared at the words, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. Had he lost sight of why he became a police officer in the first place? Outside the courthouse, the protests grew larger and more diverse. Activists, students, families, and even off-duty police officers joined the demonstrations, calling for justice and reform. Naomi Porter, Elijah's younger sister, became a prominent voice in the movement, organizing rallies and speaking to the press. At one rally, Naomi stood on a makeshift stage, her voice amplified by a megaphone. "My brother's story is just one of many," she declared. "We're here to demand accountability, not just for him, but for everyone who has been wronged by this system. This is not about revenge. It's about justice." The crowd erupted in cheers, their chants echoing through the city streets. "No justice, no peace, no justice, no peace." Among the crowd was Sarah Campbell. She had come alone, her presence unnoticed by most. As she listened to Naomi's speech, She felt a pang of guilt. She had spent years ignoring the systemic issues that now stared her in the face. For the first time, she began to see the bigger picture. Meanwhile, Elijah watched the protests from a distance, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and sorrow. He admired his sister's courage but worried about the burden she was taking on. "She's stronger than she realizes," he murmured to Maria as they prepared for the next day in court. The trial took a dramatic turn when Maria presented evidence of systemic bias within the precinct. She introduced a series of internal emails and memos obtained through a whistleblower, revealing a disturbing pattern of racial profiling. One email, written by a senior officer, explicitly instructed patrol units to focus on areas with high black populations because they were more likely to yield arrests. Another memo dismissed complaints of excessive force, describing them as overreactions from troublemakers. The courtroom fell silent as the jury read the documents. Even Greg Daniels looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat as he tried to formulate a rebuttal. Maria didn't stop there. She called to the stand a former officer who had resigned in protest of the department's practices. "I joined the force to serve my community," the officer testified, her voice steady but emotional. "But I quickly realized that the department wasn't interested in serving, it was interested in control. Officers like David Campbell were rewarded for their aggressiveness, not their fairness." David watched from the defense table, his face pale, the words cut deep, forcing him to confront the reality of his actions. He had always seen himself as a protector, but now he realized he had become something else entirely. The day ended with Elijah taking the stand. As he recounted the night of his arrest, his voice was calm but filled with quiet intensity. "I've spent my life upholding the law," he said, looking directly at the jury. "But that night, the law failed me. It wasn't just about one officer. It was about a system that allowed him to see me as less than human. That's what we need to change." The courtroom was silent as Elijah stepped down, his words hanging in the air like a challenge. David avoided his gaze, unable to face the man he had wronged. The trial had become a national spectacle, with every development closely followed by the media and the public. The courthouse steps were packed daily with protesters, journalists, and curious onlookers, all waiting to see how the justice system would respond. Inside, the tension grew as the defense prepared to call its witnesses. David Campbell sat in the courtroom, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his actions. His defense team had advised him to remain stoic, but the truth was harder to contain with each passing day. His lawyer, Greg Daniels, insisted they stick to the narrative of reasonable suspicion, emphasizing the high-pressure nature of police work. "David," Greg said during a private meeting, "you've got to hold it together. If you show any cracks, they'll tear you apart." David nodded, but his resolve was crumbling. Each witness for the prosecution, victims, former officers, experts, added another layer to the damning portrait of a department riddled with bias and misconduct. The evidence was overwhelming, and David knew it. The day came for David to take the stand. He adjusted his tie nervously as he approached the witness chair, aware of the piercing gaze of the jury and the cameras. "Officer Campbell," Greg began, "can you describe the events of the night in question?" David recounted the stop in a monotone voice, careful to frame his actions as procedural and justified. But under cross-examination, Maria Santiago was relentless. "Officer Campbell," Maria said, her voice calm but cutting, "you've testified that you acted based on reasonable suspicion. Can you define what, specifically, seemed suspicious about Mr. Porter?" David hesitated. It was late, and he was driving a high-end car in a neighborhood known for crime. Maria stepped closer, her eyes locked on his. "So, if I understand correctly, his presence in that neighborhood, while black, was your basis for suspicion." David shifted uncomfortably. "It wasn't just that. It was." "Let me clarify," Maria interrupted, her voice rising. If Mr. Porter had been white, wearing the same suit, driving the same car, in the same neighborhood, would you have stopped him? The courtroom fell silent. David opened his mouth, but no words came out. The truth, unspoken for so long, weighed heavily on him. He finally muttered, "I don't know." It wasn't the definitive answer Maria wanted, but the damage was done. The jury's expressions shifted, their skepticism palpable. Behind the scenes, the case became a battleground for political forces. Activist groups used the trial to demand sweeping reforms, while police unions and conservative lawmakers pushed back, framing the case as an attack on law enforcement. News pundits debated endlessly, turning the courtroom drama into fodder for ratings. Elijah Porter became an unwilling symbol of resistance. He received invitations to speak at rallies and interviews with major networks, but he declined most of them. His focus remained on the trial and the larger fight for justice. One night, Elijah met with Maria and a small group of advisors at his home. Among them was Naomi, his sister, whose activism had made her a rising star in the movement. "We're gaining momentum," Naomi said, scrolling through her phone. "Petitions, protests, donations, it's all growing. But we need to think bigger." Maria raised an eyebrow. "Bigger how?" Naomi leaned forward, her voice passionate. "We need legislative change, police reform bills, civilian oversight. This can't just end with David Campbell. It has to go further." Elijah admired his sister's determination, but he was cautious. "Naomi, I agree, but we have to focus. The trial is the cornerstone. If we overextend, we risk losing everything." Naomi sighed, frustrated but understanding. "Just promise me we won't stop after this." Elijah nodded. "We won't." For David Campbell, the trial had become an agonizing reckoning. Each day in court stripped away another layer of his defenses, exposing the prejudice and systemic failures he had long ignored. At night, he lay awake, haunted by the faces of the people he had wronged. One evening, Sarah found him in the garage, sitting on an old workbench, staring at a stack of unopened letters from the precinct. She hesitated before speaking. "David," she began softly, "you don't have to fight this alone." David looked up, his eyes tired. "What choice do I have? If I admit I was wrong, I lose everything." Sarah knelt beside him, placing a hand on his arm. "Maybe losing everything is what it takes to make things right." David stared at her, his mind racing. He thought of the letter from the boy he had saved years ago. He thought of the men and women who had trusted him to serve and protect, and how he had let them down. The truth was unbearable, but it was also unavoidable. The next morning, David made a decision. He called his lawyer and requested a meeting. "I want to testify again," he said. "But this time, I'm telling the whole truth." Greg Daniels was incredulous. "David, do you understand what you're saying? You'll destroy your defense." "I've already destroyed myself," David replied. "It's time I own up to it." When David returned to the stand, the courtroom was abuzz with speculation. No one knew what he was about to say, not even Greg. Elijah watched intently, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Maria approached the witness stand. "Officer Campbell, you've requested to revise your testimony." "Why?" David took a deep breath. "Because I haven't been honest. Not with this court. Not with myself." The room fell silent. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, intrigued. "I stopped Mr. Porter that night because he was black," David admitted, his voice trembling. "I didn't have any real suspicion. I assumed he didn't belong in that neighborhood. And I've done it before. I've done it to others." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Elijah's heart pounded as he absorbed the words. Maria remained composed, but her eyes betrayed her surprise. David continued, his voice breaking. "I've spent years justifying my actions, telling myself it was about safety. But it wasn't. It was about fear. fear that was ingrained in me from the start by my training, my colleagues, even my upbringing. I was wrong. And I'm sorry. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the revelation sending shockwaves through the proceedings. The judge banged her gavel, restoring order. Maria turned to the jury. No further questions. Your Honor. As David stepped down from the stand, he avoided eye contact with everyone. But as he passed Elijah, their eyes met for a brief moment. In that glance, Elijah saw not just guilt, but a flicker of humanity. It wasn't enough to erase the harm, but it was a painful, necessary step toward something better. The courtroom was packed to capacity on the day the jury delivered its verdict. A palpable tension hung in the air as people whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between Elijah Porter, who sat calmly at the plaintiff's table, and David Campbell, who looked pale and resigned at the defense table. The judge entered, her stern expression silencing the room. Has the jury reached a verdict? She asked, her voice steady. A middle-aged juror stood, holding a sheet of paper. We have, Your Honor. The room seemed to hold its breath as the foreperson read the decision. In the matter of Elijah Porter versus David Campbell and the Brookhaven Police Department, we find the defendants guilty of violating Mr. Porter's civil rights. The crowd erupted, cheers mixed with gasps, and the sounds of reporters hastily scribbling notes filled the space. The judge banged her gavel, demanding order. Elijah felt a surge of relief wash over him. Justice had been served, not just for himself but for the countless others whose voices had been silenced. Across the courtroom, David sat motionless. He expected this outcome, but hearing the words aloud made the weight of his actions undeniable. As the judge announced the penalties, financial restitution, mandatory departmental reforms, and disciplinary actions, David lowered his head. His career was over, but deep down, he knew this wasn't the end of his journey. After the proceedings, Elijah stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and supporters. He raised his hand to quiet the crowd before speaking. This verdict is a victory, but it's only the beginning, he said, his voice clear and firm. We must dismantle the systems that allow prejudice to thrive. Today, we've taken a step forward, but there is still much work to be done. The crowd erupted into applause, their chants of justice echoing through the city. In the weeks following the trial, the town of Brookhaven became a focal point for national conversations about police reform. Community leaders, activists, and law enforcement officials began holding forums to discuss the path forward. Elijah was invited to speak at one such forum. The auditorium was filled with a mix of attendees, citizens eager for change, skeptical officers, and local politicians. Standing at the podium, Elijah addressed the room with a blend of passion and pragmatism. We can't fix what we don't acknowledge, he began. This isn't about blaming every officer or tearing down institutions. It's about rebuilding trust and ensuring accountability. True justice isn't about punishment. It's about prevention. The audience listened intently, some nodding in agreement, others remaining guarded. After Elijah's speech, a young officer approached him. Mr. Porter, she said hesitantly, I joined the force to make a difference, but seeing what happened, I feel ashamed. How do we fix this? Elijah looked at her, his expression softening. It starts with self-awareness and education. Challenge biases, hold each other accountable, and don't be afraid to speak up when something feels wrong. Change begins with people like you. Meanwhile, David Campbell began his own journey toward redemption. After resigning from the police force, he volunteered with a community organization focused on bridging the gap between law enforcement and marginalized communities. His initial presence was met with hostility, but over time, his willingness to listen and learn began to earn him tentative respect. One evening, David attended a workshop where former officers and activists shared their experiences. A young black man, Marcus, recounted his own harrowing encounter with police brutality. As he spoke, David felt a pang of guilt. Marcus's story mirrored those of many individuals he had dismissed during his career. After the workshop, David approached Marcus hesitantly. "I'm sorry for what you've been through," he said. "I know I can't undo the past, but I want to be part of the solution." Marcus studied him for a moment before nodding. "It's a start." As reforms began to take shape, Brookhaven underwent a slow but significant transformation. The police department introduced new training programs focused on de-escalation and cultural sensitivity. A civilian oversight committee was established to review complaints and ensure transparency. Officers who resisted the changes were replaced, signaling a shift in the department's culture. Naomi Porter, now a prominent activist, worked tirelessly to keep the momentum alive. She organized town hall meetings, collaborated with local leaders, and continued to push for broader legislative changes. Her energy and charisma made her a beacon of hope for the community. Elijah watched his sister with pride, marveling at her ability to inspire others. He had always been the measured one, but Naomi's fiery determination reminded him that change required both strategy and passion. One day, Naomi and Elijah attended a rally together. As they stood on the stage, looking out at the diverse crowd, Naomi turned to her brother. "Do you think we've done enough?" she asked. Elijah smiled. "Enough? No, but we've done something, and that's more than most people ever try." The rally ended with a moment of silence for those who had lost their lives to police violence. As the crowd held their candles high, Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, but the foundations for change had been laid. Months after the trial, Elijah received an unexpected letter. It was from David Campbell. The handwriting was neat but hesitant, as if each word had been carefully chosen. In the letter, David apologized again for his actions and shared his experiences working with the community organization. He expressed his hope that someday he could fully atone for the harm he had caused. Elijah read the letter twice, his emotions conflicting. Part of him wanted to dismiss it as too little, too late, but another part saw it as a sign that change was possible, even in the most unlikely places. Later that week, Elijah attended a community event where David was scheduled to speak. When David took the stage, the room fell silent. He began by recounting his upbringing and the biases he had inherited, then described the transformation he had undergone since the trial. "I don't expect forgiveness," David said, his voice heavy with emotion, "but I hope my story can serve as a warning and a call to action. We have to do better. All of us." Elijah watched from the back of the room, his expression unreadable. When the event ended, David approached him, his demeanor humble. "Thank you for coming," David said quietly. "It means a lot." Elijah nodded. "Keep doing the work. Words are a start, but actions matter more." As they shook hands, it felt like a small but significant step toward reconciliation. In the years that followed, Brookhaven became a model for community-driven policing. The reforms inspired similar efforts in other cities, proving that change, while slow and difficult, was possible. Elijah continued his work as a federal prosecutor, but his experience with the trial shifted his focus. He became an advocate for systemic reform, using his platform to challenge injustice and push for progress. As he stood on the steps of the courthouse one crisp autumn morning, preparing to deliver a speech, Elijah looked out at the crowd and saw a reflection of his dream. A world where justice was truly blind and every voice mattered. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, he felt hopeful.